We have a fantastic session today on nuclear export financing with Lindsey Walter, Director of International Policy at the Climate and Energy Program at Third Way. Now, before we get started with the conversation about export finance, Lindsay was just telling us that she is a new convert to nuclear, that she used to be opposed to nuclear, but then she had a change of heart. And so she said she would talk to us about why. So Lindsay, briefly tell your conversion story to nuclear.
Very briefly, because you insisted, I was here to talk about financing, but I suppose this is more interesting. I am 4 years recent into the nuclear energy field, and previously I was anti-nuclear, just coming from a Californian environmentalist hippie background. I did my Fulbright in Germany with a bunch of academics that were anti-nuclear, and it wasn't until I started working at Third Way around 5 years ago and was leading our team's energy systems analysis, where we look at what it takes to get to net zero emissions and what the different scenarios are where the math just doesn't line up if you don't have nuclear. So that was the crack in the thinking. And then since then, I've gotten to know a lot more about the technology and the options. And now I'm a convert. So now I'm talking on a finance export nuclear panel at COP. So you can come around full circle, apparently.
Amazing. And Third Way is a sponsor of Net Zero Nuclear. And it's all because of you. So that's wonderful. So Lindsay, I want you to first just give a summary of the main conclusions of your new report called Nuclear Export Financing Today and Tomorrow, from which we stole the title for this panel.
So we released a report just this past month on nuclear export finance after a workshop that we held in DC with some of the leading thought leaders in this space, and really provided a summary of some of the export financing fixes that we can do in order for the US to become more competitive in the international commercial nuclear energy market. So to summarize the first set of conclusions, a lot of them were focused around EXIM, which is a pretty powerful export credit agency that the US has access to, and one of the largest tools that we have for nuclear export finance. And there's a few things that can be done immediately in order to better leverage this source of funding for our commercial nuclear exports. The very first one is on reshaping the higher level commitment to the cultural practices within EXIM. There is a long history of conservative lending within the EXIM Bank. And this really started back in 2015 when there was a lapse in the charter due to some partisan issues in the US, which seemed to be coming back around. It led to a period of difficulty for EXIM where there was no quorum on the board of directors and they couldn't approve any lending over $10 million. So after this history, about 4 years there of extreme difficulty in lending, there's been this culture of conservative lending at EXIM. So starting with clear direction and leadership from the board of directors is an important starting place. The second area was on updating policies to modernize the international standards for EXIM. So right now, the standards that EXIM are offering are constrained in a way that no other export credit agency is currently observing. Some key examples of this is that EXIM is still charging commitment fees of 0.5% to sovereign borrowers, which no other export credit agency is currently doing, and also requiring a domestic content where the EXIM will only finance up to the percentage of domestic content in a final product. It is the only ECA that does this. Every other ECA only requires 50% domestic content or less. So for example, the UK is 20% and Canada is 0%. So this was initially intended to make EXIM more competitive in providing opportunities for US manufacturing and jobs in the US, but actually it has hurt our competitiveness in comparison to countries that have 50% or less domestic content requirements. There's other work that can be done to fix EXIM, but the two other big ones that I wanted to highlight, there's the China and Transformational Exports Program. We call it CTEP for short. And projects that are eligible for CTEP have lower fees and extended repayment tenors, benefits that make it a lot easier to finance these export projects. But nuclear is unclear whether it is included or not. So a really important fix would be making sure that nuclear is explicitly included in CTEP in order for it to have access to these enhanced financing options. The final thing I want to flag for the EXIM point is on the default cap rate. So right now, 2% of the total active credit portfolio is all EXIM has before that can be in default and there is a freeze on the lending cap. No other ECA has this, and we are recommending increasing the default rate cap to 4%. So these are some of the big fixes for EXIM. I'm not going to get into it, but our report also has some recommendations for DFC, as well as what can be done, not just on the financing side, but on the pre-project work as well. So when we talk about nuclear export financing, that's really at the end of what is a long trail of working up ahead of time, doing capacity building, technical assistance, workforce development, feasibility studies. This is all work that needs to be done on the front end where the U.S. can improve our performance in order to better set us up for international financing.
What are the criteria for a good project that the U.S. is likely to finance? And what is all the work that you need to do in the pre-finance work? What is that you're talking about?
Especially in the pre-project work, if you're a newcomer country, the U.S. isn't just going to sell you a reactor. You have to have a 1, 2, 3 agreement. You have to go through all of these steps ahead of time in order for the U.S. to export nuclear technology. So when we think about the criteria for nuclear exports, it's not just whether or not it is meeting good financial criteria and whether or not it's a fair risk for a financer to take. It's also all of this work making sure a company has its regulatory and licensing body in place. And that's basically what we talk about with pre-criteria work.
Why is export finance particularly important for nuclear as opposed to other industries?
We know the reasons why the world needs nuclear. We heard at COP the commitment to a tripling of nuclear. And one of the biggest hurdles to nuclear is financing. I work a lot in Europe. We opened an office in Brussels about 2 years ago. And within the European countries, one of the biggest things we hear, if you're able to get past those who just want to talk about waste and security issues, the next one is financing. And so competitive export finance packages are essential if the United States is going to be a player globally, and not just the United States, depending on what other suppliers we're talking about. We are more focused on the US here based on our study. But we need nuclear in order to be competitive in this growing market. And one thing we talk about with our US audience is if the US is not competing, then Russia and China are setting the standards for safety and security and non-proliferation globally. In order for us to be setting those standards, the United States needs to be a player in this field, and that means competitive export financing packages.
We had this question in the audience, so let me go take that.
This is not a criticism of what you do. I think you're doing a wonderful job. But looking at the bigger picture, we're supposed to meet this 2050 goal, which means to electrify all our economies a little over 2 decades. The question I have, is there enough capital in the world to be able to finance that?
I mentioned that I converted to nuclear energy doing our energy systems analysis work, and we did a study in Europe at the EU level looking at pathways to get to net zero, and those that exclude nuclear versus those that include nuclear cost 80 billion euros more a year by 2050. So there's this question of, do we have the upfront capital? And I think that's an important one, keeping in mind that as we get better at building these things and as we're able to get further down the innovation chain, they'll be cheaper. But there's also a broader question of the cost of the transition and where nuclear energy can help with broader systems costs.
You mentioned that something needs to prepare the export procedure in terms of analysis. Right now, you mentioned a system analysis. So my question is, how is the process structured or should be structured in 2 ways? First, a stakeholder assessment in which type of ESG playground nuclear comes when it lands in the country of export. And second, you mentioned system analysis. If I take the experience of Europe, Denmark is very different than Italy. We're a manufacturing economy. They're more offshore wind, they have a smaller density, etc. So how does the system analysis factor in the U.S. decision to export, or if it does at all? Thank you.
So there's a couple different departments and agencies involved in the U.S. that are part of these kind of pre-projects works. There's the State Department, which has been doing a lot of work in preparing capacity building for newcomer countries in particular. They recently established FIRST, which is the Foundational Infrastructure for Responsible Use of SMR Technology, and the whole role of this program is to engage with newcomer countries and do capacity building. And they've also introduced Project Phoenix, which is looking at opportunities to convert coal to nuclear. They're doing this with feasibility studies, with analyses on regulatory readiness, and on also providing advisory services. So the State Department is just one department within the U.S. government involved in this sort of pre-work. There's also the USTDA, the Trade and Development Agency, that will do feed studies. They did this in Romania, for example, with RoPower. They provided a grant for their feed study for the first SMR plant back in 2022 for Romania. And then there's also the NRC, our Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that does work on establishing regulatory and licensing in newcomer countries as well. So I think if anything, there's maybe a need to streamline this work across agencies, but there's a lot of steps that you have to go through if you're going to export a nuclear reactor in the United States. I think it's something like 6 different agencies and programs at minimum involved in the process.
I want to talk about the international export finance market and if the U.S. is competitive. You were talking about some of the issues that the U.S. export finance has, but when you look at the broad scope of export finance opportunities, how does the U.S. stack up?
We have some real competition. Honest truth is that Russia and China will provide 85% debt financing and meet the rest of the 15% with equity, which the United States doesn't really do, which EXIM can't do. DFC has some tools for equity financing, which could probably be improved. There is work that can be done to compete with the financing packages that Russia and China are putting forward. One thing that's important to keep in mind is a lot of the countries that we're engaging with aren't looking for a one-for-one match for what Russia and China are providing. They are very well aware of how happy these countries are to use nuclear energy as a geopolitical tool. So thinking that the United States has to perfectly match these financing packages, I think is foolish. We're not going to. We have a different market. We have private companies involved. We're not state-owned enterprises. But there is work that the United States can do to put the weight of our government, the patient capital of our government, behind our projects and leverage private sector capital. So it depends on your definition of competitive, but a lot of folks want nuclear energy from the United States. So we just need enough to allow them to build it and to provide that secure background. It doesn't have to be a 100% financing package. That's not what they're looking for.
We've been talking a lot about the U.S. and U.S. export finance, but are there ways for the U.S. to work with its allies and partners to make it more competitive offering? Is there something that we can do that is international in terms of the financing?
Two quick things. One is there is a proposal out there for an international bank for nuclear infrastructure, which would bring together financing from a handful of different countries, including the US, Canada, Japan, UK. And this would be a great way to leverage these, what we talked about earlier, that patient public capital in order to leverage private sector capital. So there's more that could be done in setting up some sort of international infrastructure bank that's intentionally collaborating on nuclear energy projects. And then the second thing I'll say is another wonky EXIM fix. I'm realizing that most of my talking points read way better than they work in like a panel speaking platform because they're so nerdy. But the other minor EXIM fix here is that if we were to co-finance a project with a different country, EXIM has to account for 100% of the financing and the risk for that project. So another small fix is if you could separate and require EXIM to only account for the portion of financing that it's responsible for, that would also help unlock more EXIM capital.
I've been hearing about a project right now in Poland, and the new administration has come in and demanded that Westinghouse, which is on track to build a 3-reactor plant in northern Poland, to put up 30% skin in the game, to take a 30% stake in the project. Westinghouse is a private company. It's not in a position to do that. Got a market cap of like 9 billion, so it doesn't have the firepower. Do you have any information or any ideas on how the U.S. can facilitate a relationship like that? And I do believe Poland is one of those countries that's very eager to work with the U.S. if possible.
You're making a very important point, and actually there was a lot of talk and ask from the Poland government for the United States to help with some sort of equity financing. They were asking for kind of a modest 25 million in equity financing coming from the United States and partners as a good faith effort to show the U.S. is not only committed to this project, but is committed to longer term bilateral engagement in Poland around nuclear energy. So there is more that the government can do to put its backing behind these projects and support the private capital. I do think the U.S. has put, forget if it's 23 or 28 million in different financing packages towards Poland already. So I don't know exactly the specifics of the portion that you're talking about, but that is where the U.S. government can step in and make sure that there is adequate public support and public guarantee for the project in Poland, for the AP1000, and also looking at the future SMRs. Poland has an ambitious goal to build, I think, 80 SMRs by 2035. So there'll be a lot of work that needs to be done there on the financing aspect as well.
For Lindsay, you mentioned setting up a special entity to facilitate nuclear financing. There are already lots of financial institutions, World Bank, etc., that won't finance nuclear today. Isn't it easier to work to get them to help finance nuclear projects than to set up a new entity just for this purpose?
Potentially, but we haven't seen a lot of progress on that front. The other thing that we have seen, even with DFC, which has a history of not allowing nuclear and only recently has allowed it, there's a real issue with nuclear expertise and experience within these financing agencies. And so having one that is dedicated to nuclear energy, that understands the industry, understand what it takes to finance and build these projects, is really important. And we're just not seeing that happen with these larger infrastructure banks that already exist. So nuclear is a special technology. What's required and the knowledge and expertise and history to build nuclear is quite different. So if you could get them to change, maybe. Randy,
I just want to
editorialize
make
it.
a comment on the politics, which is one of the biggest, if arguably the most important announcement that's come from the COP so far is the AAA nuclear declaration. And it's important to note that that was not part of the sort of main COP set of announcements, and the politics have a role in that. And so if you can't get something like that as part of the main COP declaration, just imagine trying to work through another big bureaucracy like the World Bank. The politics would be very, very challenging. The discussion in the previous panel about Germany, they need to change the tone in Germany before we'll be able to change the tone at the World Bank. Thank you all. I wanted to see, are there any final comments?
I'll conclude by saying there's some fixes that could happen right now that are easy to do, easy to make, and those are in the report. I mentioned a few today. And there's those that might require a little bit more work, like changing statutory pieces of things. And that's going to require congressional action. That might be a bit of a longer road. But if you put the two together, we can put together competitive financing packages. And if you have questions and want to read the report that we put on Third Way's website, please come up and speak with me, and I'm happy to send you in the right direction.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you again, and thank you all.